Welcome back to Night Mode Lore. Tonight, we're exploring the complete story of Elizabeth Afton, the daughter who became Circus Baby, the child who died seeking her father's love, the little girl who was killed by the machine her father created, supposedly for her, being tragedy embodied, being story of child desperate for parental attention, of daughter seeking father's approval, of little girl who died because William Afton was neglectful parent, was absent father, was person who created deadly animatronic and failed to protect his daughter from it. Elizabeth's story being profoundly sad, being deeply tragic, being tale not of horror but of heartbreak, not of evil but of desperation, not of villainy but of childhood innocence destroyed. Elizabeth being victim, being child, being person who deserved protection and received danger, who deserved love and received neglect, who deserved father's attention and received only father's deadly creations. Her story being examination of William Afton's failures as parent, being evidence of how his evil destroyed his own family, being tragedy of daughter killed by father's creation, being Elizabeth Afton's complete journey from neglected child to possessed animatronic to supposed liberation, being told tonight, being explored comprehensively, being examined with compassion appropriate to her story, to her tragedy, to her complete innocence and absolute victimhood. This is comprehensive exploration of Elizabeth Afton's life and death, her possession of Circus Baby, her time trapped underground, her formation of Ennard, her escape using her brother Michael's body, her rejection by other animatronics, her deterioration into Scrap Baby, her continued search for father's attention even after death, her presence at Freddy Fazbear's pizza place, her burning in Henry's fire, her supposed liberation, examining not just what happened to her but what it meant. Not just the events but the emotions, not just the timeline but the tragedy, understanding Elizabeth as character, as victim, as child who died too young, as daughter who never received the love she deserved, as person trapped in machine for decades, as consciousness persisting in animatronic designed to kill children. The irony being cruel, being profound, being evidence of how completely William Afton failed as father. Elizabeth dying because of him, dying in machine he created, dying while seeking attention he never gave, her death being his fault, her tragedy being his responsibility, her suffering being consequence of his neglect, his absence, his prioritization of work over family, of creations over children, of experiments over daughter. William Afton destroying Elizabeth just as he destroyed crying child, just as he destroyed Michael, being father who harmed all his children, who failed everyone in his family. Elizabeth being examined as evidence of this, as victim of this, as tragedy resulting from this, being explored tonight completely. Whether you're discovering Elizabeth's story for the first time, revisiting familiar tragedy as you drift toward sleep, or simply letting the exploration wash over you as consciousness fades, this will carry you through her complete timeline, every moment of her life, every detail of her death, every aspect of her possession, every element of her persistence, being comprehensive examination designed to give you complete understanding while gently facilitating rest, being story told with compassion despite its sadness, being analysis delivered soothingly despite its tragedy, being night mode lore's approach, comprehensive coverage in sleep-facilitating format, respecting both the content and the purpose, treating Elizabeth's story seriously while acknowledging you're here to rest, to sleep, to find calm in detailed storytelling, in complete examination, in thorough analysis that engages mind just enough to quiet anxious thoughts, but not so much that sleep becomes impossible, being exactly what you need, being Elizabeth Afton's complete story, being Circus Baby's full timeline, being Daughter's tragedy, told completely, told gently, told for sleep. Elizabeth deserving this respect, deserving this comprehensive telling, deserving to be understood fully, to be examined thoroughly, to be remembered completely, being child victim, being innocent daughter, being person who suffered because of father's failures, being examined now with appropriate compassion, appropriate sadness, appropriate recognition of her tragedy. Let's begin this journey through Elizabeth's story, understanding that we start not with monster but with child, not with villain but with victim, not with evil but with innocence. Elizabeth Afton being little girl, being William's daughter, being youngest child in dysfunctional family, being person who wanted love, who sought approval, who desired attention from father who was absent, who was neglectful, who was focused on work, on experiments, on animatronics rather than on children. Elizabeth growing up in William Afton's house, being tragedy waiting to happen, being child at risk, being daughter in danger because father created danger, because father brought danger home, because father prioritized creations over children's safety, Elizabeth's death being preventable, being William's fault, being tragedy that didn't have to happen, being examined now, being understood completely, beginning with who she was, understanding what she wanted, examining how she died, being complete story, being told now, being Elizabeth Afton from beginning to end, from life to death to possession to liberation, being comprehensive examination, being thorough exploration, being compassionate telling of tragic story, beginning now, beginning with the child, with the daughter, with Elizabeth before she became baby, before she died, before tragedy occurred, being who she was, being examined first, being understood before continuing, being Elizabeth Afton, being William's daughter, being explored completely. Part 1. Elizabeth's Life and Death, The Fatal Attraction, 1980s. As we begin this exploration, as sleep starts to pull you deeper, let us examine Elizabeth's life before death, who she was as child, what her family was like, what her relationship with father was. Understanding Elizabeth Afton as person before understanding her as Circus Baby. Elizabeth being youngest child, being daughter, being little girl in William Afton's house, being child of murderer though not knowing it, being daughter of engineer who created animatronics, being person growing up surrounded by mechanical creations, by robots, by entertainment machines that father built. Elizabeth's childhood being shaped by father's work, by his obsessions, by his priorities that valued creations over children, valued work over family, valued experiments over daughter's needs. Elizabeth growing up neglected, growing up without adequate attention, growing up desperate for father to notice her, to acknowledge her, to give her the love and approval she craved. Elizabeth's life being characterized by this desperation, by this need for father's attention, by this desire to be seen by William, to be important to him, to matter to him. Elizabeth wanting what children deserve, what daughters should receive, what William refused to give. Being parent who failed, who neglected, who was absent even when present. Elizabeth's life being tragic even before her death, being sad even before the machine killed her, being evidence of William's failures as father, being examined now comprehensively. Elizabeth Afton, the neglected daughter. Elizabeth was William Afton's daughter, being youngest child after crying child and Michael, being little girl in family defined by dysfunction, by father's absence, by tragedy waiting to happen. Elizabeth's exact age being unclear, but being young child, being elementary school age possibly, being little girl who should have been protected, who should have been supervised, who should have been kept safe from danger. Elizabeth being child in William Afton's house, meaning being child at risk, being daughter of man who created deadly animatronics, who brought danger into home, who failed to prioritize children's safety. Elizabeth growing up surrounded by her father's creations, by animatronics, by mechanical entertainers, by robots that fascinated her, that drew her attention, that represented father's work, father's priorities, father's focus. Elizabeth being drawn to animatronics because they were what father cared about, because they were what father spent time on, because they were what father valued. Elizabeth understanding implicitly that father loved his creations, that he prioritized his work, that he cared about animatronics. Elizabeth wanting to be like animatronics, wanting to be something father cared about, wanting to matter to him the way his creations mattered, being child psychology, being daughter's desperation, being Elizabeth's tragedy beginning before her death, being established in her life, in her relationship with father, in her desperate need for attention that would ultimately kill her. The family dynamics being profoundly dysfunctional. William being absent father, being neglectful parent, being person focused on work rather than children. Michael being older brother who was bully, who caused crying child's death, who was damaged person in damaged family. Crying child being dead, possibly by time Elizabeth was old enough to remember, or being terrified child who cried constantly, being traumatized, being evidence of family's dysfunction. Elizabeth growing up in this environment, in house where father was absent, where brother was troubled, where younger brother was dead or dying or terrified. Elizabeth being youngest, being trying to navigate this dysfunction, being seeking love in loveless house, being wanting attention from father who gave none. Elizabeth's childhood being lonely, being sad, being desperate, being characterized by need for father's love, for William's attention, for acknowledgement that she mattered, that she was important, that she was valued. Elizabeth never receiving this, never getting what she needed, never being prioritized by father, being neglected child, being ignored daughter, being person who mattered less to William than his animatronics, than his work, than his experiments. Elizabeth understanding this, feeling this, being hurt by this, being desperate because of this, wanting so badly to matter to father, to be important to him, to receive his attention, Elizabeth's desperation being tragic, being understandable, being what any child would feel in her situation, being examined with compassion, being understood as normal childhood need perverted by abnormal family situation, being Elizabeth's psychology, being her motivation, being what would lead to her death. Circus Baby, created to kill. Circus Baby was animatronic created by William Afton, being one of Funtime animatronics, being advanced design, being sophisticated machine, being entertainment robot designed for Circus Baby's pizza world, being a centerpiece of new restaurant, being star attraction, being a most advanced animatronic William had created, being technological achievement, being innovation in entertainment robotics, being murder machine, being child killing device, being animatronic with hidden purpose, with deadly function, with capability to capture and kill children. Circus Baby being designed with claw mechanism, with storage tank, with ability to lure child close, to grab child, to pull child inside, to kill child, to store body. Being deliberately designed murder weapon disguised as entertainment animatronic. Being William's creation. Being Purple Guy's innovation. Being child murderer's tool. William creating Circus Baby to kill children. Designing her specifically for this purpose. Building her with deadly mechanisms. With killing capabilities, with murder functions hidden within entertainment exterior. Circus Baby being beautiful, being sophisticated, being appealing to children, being designed to attract them, to draw them close, to gain their trust, to exploit that trust, to kill them. Being William's creation, being evidence of his evil, being proof of his complete corruption. William designing machine to kill children, building animatronic for murder, creating entertainment robot that was actually death trap. The specific design being sophisticated, Baby being programmed to dispense ice cream, to attract children with promise of treat, children being drawn to her, approaching her, wanting ice cream, Baby dispensing ice cream when alone, when single child present, when conditions right for murder, the ice cream being lure, being bait, being attraction that brought child close enough for claw to grab, for mechanism to activate, for murder to occur, the claw extending from Baby's torso, grabbing child, pulling child into storage tank, killing child, hiding body, being complete murder system, being comprehensive killing machine, being animatronic designed specifically to capture and kill children, William creating this, William building this, William programming this, being evidence of his complete evil, of his total depravity, of his corruption being so profound that he would design machine to kill children, that he would build animatronic for murder, that he would create entertainment robot that murdered, William being monster, being villain, being evil personified, Circus Baby being his creation, being evidence of what he was, being proof of his crimes, being murder weapon he built, being examined now as what she was, as child-killing machine, as deadly animatronic, as William's evil made physical, being created to kill, being designed for murder, being built to capture children, being Circus Baby, being examined comprehensively. Didn't you make her just for me, Daddy? Elizabeth was fascinated by Circus Baby, being drawn to animatronic, being attracted to her father's creation, being excited about Baby, wanting to see her, wanting to meet her, wanting to interact with her. Elizabeth seeing Circus Baby as connection to father, as something father made, as evidence of father's brilliance, as proof of father's capabilities. Elizabeth being proud of father's creation, being excited about animatronic, being child who saw Baby and wanted to be near her, wanted to approach her, wanted to interact with her. Elizabeth asking father about Baby, being told no, being told to stay away, being told not to approach. William warning Elizabeth, telling daughter not to go near Circus Baby, telling her to avoid animatronic. Being rare moment of father giving daughter attention, of William acknowledging Elizabeth, of him speaking to her, warning her, telling her no, being negative attention, being restrictive attention, being father saying no rather than spending time, being prohibition rather than engagement, William telling Elizabeth not to approach baby and leaving it at that, not supervising adequately, not ensuring Elizabeth obeyed, not protecting daughter from danger he created, William creating deadly animatronic and bringing daughter to location where animatronic was, creating danger and placing daughter near danger, warning her but not protecting her, telling her no but not ensuring compliance, being negligent father, being inadequate parent, being person who failed to protect daughter. Elizabeth's question being heartbreaking, being evidence of her desperation, being proof of her need for father's attention. Elizabeth asking William, "Didn't you make her just for me, Daddy?" Being child's interpretation, being daughter's understanding. Elizabeth seeing Circus Baby as gift, as something father made for her, as evidence that father cared, as proof that father thought about her. Elizabeth wanting to believe that baby was made for her, that father created animatronic with daughter in mind, that William built baby as gift for Elizabeth, being child's desperate need to matter to father, to be important to him, to be thought of by him. Elizabeth seeing baby and thinking, "Father made this for me," being tragic misunderstanding, being complete inversion of truth, baby not being made for Elizabeth, being made to kill children, being murder machine, being deadly trap, but Elizabeth thinking baby was gift, was present, was evidence of father's love. Elizabeth approaching baby because she thought animatronic was made for her, because she believed father created baby with her in mind, because she desperately wanted to believe she mattered to father, that he thought about her, that he cared enough to create something for her, being child psychology, being daughter's desperation, being Elizabeth's tragic misunderstanding that would kill her, being examined with compassion, being understood as normal childhood need perverted by circumstances, being heartbreaking rather than horrifying, being sad rather than scary, being Elizabeth's tragedy beginning, being her fatal mistake born from desperate need for father's love. The fatal day, death by father's creation. The day Elizabeth died being day Circus Baby's Pizza World opened, being day of party, being event with children present, Elizabeth being there, being at restaurant, being near animatronics, being specifically near Circus Baby despite father's warnings, Elizabeth being drawn to baby, being unable to resist, being child who desperately wanted to approach animatronic she thought was made for her, Elizabeth finding moment when she was alone, when supervision lapsed, when she could approach baby without being stopped, Elizabeth being drawn to ice cream, to treat that baby was dispensing, to lure that was designed to attract children, Elizabeth approaching, being excited, being happy, being thinking she was getting treat, being thinking she was interacting with animatronic father made for her, Elizabeth being close enough, being alone, being conditions being right for baby's programming to activate, for murder mechanism to engage, for claw to extend, baby's claw emerging from her torso, grabbing Elizabeth, pulling her, Elizabeth being taken into storage tank, being pulled inside animatronic, being killed by machine, by claw, by her father's creation, Elizabeth dying instantly or dying quickly, being killed by Circus Baby, being murdered by animatronic she thought was made for her, being tragedy complete, being irony profound, being heartbreak absolute. the death being William's fault completely, being father's responsibility, being result of his negligence, his poor design choices, his prioritization of murder functionality over safety, his creation of deadly animatronic, his bringing daughter to location with deadly animatronic, his inadequate supervision, his failure to ensure Elizabeth stayed away, his failure to protect daughter, William being responsible for Elizabeth's death, being guilty of killing his daughter through negligence, through creating danger and exposing daughter to it, through failing as father, through prioritizing evil over family, through being monster, being murderer, being person who created machine that killed his own daughter. William's response to Elizabeth's death being to close Circus Baby's Pizza World, to shut down restaurant, to send animatronics to underground facility, to hide them, to conceal them. William responding to daughter's death by hiding evidence, by protecting his creations, by ensuring animatronics weren't discovered, weren't investigated, weren't revealed as deadly machines. William's priority being protecting himself, protecting his work, protecting his crimes, not grieving daughter, not taking responsibility, not changing behavior. William continuing his evil, continuing his experiments, continuing his crimes. Elizabeth's death not stopping him, not reforming him, not making him better father to surviving children. William remaining monster, remaining villain, remaining neglectful father. Elizabeth dying, and William continuing exactly as before, being evidence of his complete corruption, of his total depravity, of his being beyond redemption, beyond reform, beyond change. William being examined as father who killed daughter through negligence and continued being evil, being person who lost child and learned nothing, being monster who destroyed own family and remained monster. Immediate aftermath. Circus Baby's Pizza World closes. Circus Baby's Pizza World closed after Elizabeth's death, lasting single day, opening and closing same day, being restaurant that operated for hours before tragedy, before child died, before William's creation killed his daughter, the closure being immediate, being response to death, being William shutting down operation, hiding animatronics, concealing evidence, protecting himself, the official story being gas leak possibly, being technical malfunction possibly, being vague explanation that avoided truth, that concealed murder, that protected William, being corporate cover-up, being Fazbear Entertainment suppressing information, being system protecting killer again, being pattern established with missing children incident continuing, William getting away with daughter's death just as he got away with other children's deaths, being protected by corporation, by system, by infrastructure that prioritized profit over accountability, over truth, over justice, Elizabeth's death being covered up, being concealed, being explained away, being hidden from public, from investigation, from consequences, William avoiding responsibility, avoiding prosecution, avoiding accountability, being father who killed daughter and faced no consequences, being person who continued existing in society despite causing daughter's death, despite being responsible for tragedy. The animatronics being moved to underground facility, to Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, to location where they would be stored, where they would remain, where Elizabeth would be trapped. The fun time animatronics being sent underground, being hidden, being kept secret, Circus Baby containing Elizabeth's body, containing daughter's corpse, William knowing this, understanding this, being aware that daughter was inside animatronic, that her body was in storage tank, that baby contained Elizabeth. William sending baby underground anyway, hiding animatronic, concealing evidence, getting rid of daughter's body by hiding it in animatronic and underground facility, being cold, being cruel, being evidence of William's complete lack of empathy, complete absence of normal parental grief, complete corruption of anything resembling love. William treating daughter's death as inconvenience, as problem to solve, as evidence to hide, not as tragedy to grieve, not as loss to mourn, not as consequence to face. William being monster, being villain, being father who killed daughter and hid body, being person beyond redemption, being examined as evidence of his evil, as proof of his depravity, as demonstration of his complete corruption. William sending Elizabeth underground being final failure, being ultimate betrayal, being father abandoning daughter even in death, even after killing her, even after causing her tragedy, William moving on, continuing his life, continuing his evil, Elizabeth being trapped underground, being hidden, being concealed, being alone, being dead, being inside animatronic, being examined next in her possession, in her becoming baby, in her consciousness binding to machine that killed her. Let this tragedy rest. As this section concludes, as sleep deepens around you, let Elizabeth's life and death settle into understanding, knowing she was neglected daughter, being child desperate for father's attention, being little girl who thought Circus Baby was made for her, being person who approached animatronic seeking connection to father, being killed by machine father created, being tragedy complete, being irony profound, being heartbreak absolute, Elizabeth's death being William's fault, being result of his negligence, being evidence of his failures as father, being examined comprehensively now, being understood fully, being ready to continue to her possession, to her becoming baby, to her consciousness binding to animatronic, to her decades trapped underground, being explored after rest, after sleep, after letting this settle, Elizabeth's tragedy being established, being understood, being foundation for understanding what came next, for comprehending her possession, for examining her continued existence, being ready to continue after rest, being prepared after sleep, being able to drift knowing Elizabeth's life, knowing her death, knowing her tragedy, being ready to explore her possession next, her becoming baby, her consciousness in machine, being continued after rest. Part 2, Becoming Baby, Possession and Underground, 1980s, 2023. As we continue deeper into Elizabeth's story, as consciousness drifts further toward rest, we examine her possession of Circus Baby, how Elizabeth's spirit bound to animatronic that killed her, how daughter's consciousness became trapped in father's creation, how child became machine, Elizabeth's possession being similar to other possessions in FNAF, being murdered child spirit binding to animatronic, being a supernatural process, being remnant related possibly, being soul attaching to machine, Elizabeth dying inside baby and becoming baby, her consciousness persisting beyond death, her awareness continuing in mechanical form, Elizabeth being dead but aware, being corpse but conscious, being trapped in animatronic, being Circus Baby now, being possessed machine, being child spirit and entertainment robot, being examined now comprehensively, understanding how possession worked for Elizabeth, what it meant for her consciousness, how she experienced existence as baby, what decades underground were like, how she related to other animatronics, how she planned escape, how she manipulated situation, how she used Brother Michael, how she formed Ennard, how she escaped underground facility, how she lived in Brother's body, being Elizabeth's story continuing beyond death, being tragedy extending beyond initial death, being suffering continuing for decades, being examined now completely, possession mechanics. Elizabeth becomes baby. Elizabeth's spirit bound to Circus Baby after death, being murdered, child's consciousness attaching to animatronic, being soul binding to machine that killed her. Elizabeth becoming baby, being no longer human, being no longer physical child, being consciousness in mechanical form, being awareness in animatronic, being spirit possessing machine, the possession being immediate or nearly immediate, Elizabeth dying and binding to baby, her consciousness not passing on, not moving to afterlife, not ending, continuing in mechanical form, being trapped, being unable to leave, being bound to animatronic, Elizabeth experiencing death and immediately experiencing mechanical existence, going from child to consciousness in machine, from Elizabeth to baby, from daughter to possessed animatronic, being transformation complete, being change total, being Elizabeth ceasing to be human and becoming something else, becoming hybrid of child's consciousness and animatronic, becoming baby, being examined as possession, being understood as binding, being Elizabeth's spirit attaching to machine, her awareness continuing in baby, her consciousness trapped in animatronic that killed her, being profound irony, being cruel fate, being Elizabeth killed by baby and becoming baby, being victim becoming prison, being child becoming machine, being tragedy continuing beyond death. The experience being difficult to comprehend, being consciousness in mechanical form being unlike human experience, Elizabeth being aware but not having body, being conscious but being machine, being able to think but thinking through electronic processes, being able to act but acting through mechanical means, Elizabeth's consciousness being adapted to mechanical existence, being changed by possession, being influenced by baby's programming, by animatronics systems, by machines' functions, Elizabeth being herself but also being baby, being child consciousness but also being entertainment robot, being hybrid, being mixture, being person and machine simultaneously, Elizabeth experiencing existence as baby being strange, being alien, being fundamentally different from human experience, being consciousness without human body, being awareness without human senses, being thoughts processed through electronics, through circuits, through mechanical systems, Elizabeth adapting to this, learning to exist as baby, learning to control animatronic, learning to move mechanically, to speak through speakers, to see through cameras, to exist as machine. Elizabeth spending years, decades as baby, as consciousness in animatronic, as spirit bound to machine, being examined as what this meant for her, what this experience was like, how she processed existence as possessed animatronic, how she maintained identity while being machine, how she remained Elizabeth while being baby. Circus Baby's personality, Elizabeth and programming. Circus Baby's personality being mixture of Elizabeth's consciousness and animatronics programming, being combination of child spirit and machine's functions. Baby speaking being Elizabeth speaking but also being programming, being child and machine simultaneously. Baby's voice in sister location being sophisticated, being intelligent, being helpful to player, being Michael, being brother, Baby helping Michael navigate facility, giving him information, telling him what to do, guiding him through nights. Baby being helpful, being friendly, being trustworthy apparently, but also being manipulative, being calculating, being using Michael, being planning escape, being desperate to leave underground facility. Baby's helpfulness being strategic, being means to end, being Elizabeth using brother to achieve freedom, Baby manipulating Michael, gaining his trust, guiding him through facility so he would be positioned correctly, so escape plan could work, so Ennard could scoop him, could use his body, could escape in his form. Baby being examined as complex character, as mixture of Elizabeth's consciousness and strategic programming. Elizabeth being child, but being child who spent decades trapped underground, who was desperate for freedom, who was willing to manipulate brother to escape, who was damaged by decades of imprisonment, who was Elizabeth still, but Elizabeth changed, corrupted by circumstances, desperate by imprisonment, willing to do terrible things to escape, being examined comprehensively. The intelligence being notable, Baby being sophisticated in speech, in reasoning, in planning. Elizabeth as Baby being smarter than child Elizabeth was, being more capable, being more strategic, being consciousness that developed, that adapted, that became more complex through decades of existence. Elizabeth spending years underground, spending decades as Baby, having time to think, to plan, to strategize. Elizabeth becoming calculating, becoming manipulative, becoming person willing to use brother, to trick him, to collaborate in his scooping, to escape in his body. Elizabeth being desperate, being imprisoned for decades, making her willing to do anything to escape, to be free, to leave underground facility. Elizabeth's time as Baby being corrupting influence, being decades of imprisonment damaging her psychologically, changing her, making her more desperate, more willing to harm others, more strategic in pursuit of freedom. Elizabeth being examined as tragic figure, as child consciousness corrupted by circumstances, as person damaged by decades of imprisonment, as victim of father's creation becoming victimizer herself, using brother, harming Michael, being willing to collaborate in terrible acts to achieve freedom. Elizabeth being sympathetic but also being dangerous, being tragic but also being threat, being victim who became victimizer, being examined with nuance, being understood as complex character rather than simple victim or simple villain. Underground facility. Decades of imprisonment. The underground facility being Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, being location where Funtime animatronics were stored, where they remained for decades, where Elizabeth was trapped, being prison, being tomb, being place of isolation and confinement. Elizabeth spending decades here, being trapped underground, being in darkness, being with other animatronics but being essentially alone, being isolated from world, from humanity, from life. Elizabeth existing underground for decades, from 1980s to 2023 roughly, being approximately 40 years underground, being child consciousness trapped in mechanical form in underground facility for 40 years, being imprisonment beyond comprehension, being isolation absolute, being tragedy continuing for decades, Elizabeth not being freed, not being liberated, not escaping her prison, being trapped, being contained, being suffering continuing year after year, decade after decade. Elizabeth underground, Elizabeth in facility, Elizabeth as Baby, Elizabeth trapped, being examined as prolonged suffering, as extended tragedy, as imprisonment that lasted longer than her entire human life. Elizabeth being child who died young and spent decades as consciousness in machine underground, being profound tragedy, being suffering beyond description. The other animatronics being present, Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, Ballora, being other Funtime animatronics in facility, whether they were possessed being unclear, whether they had consciousness being ambiguous. Ballora possibly containing Mrs. Afton, William's wife, Elizabeth's mother. Being theory, being speculation. Being possible that Elizabeth was underground with mother's spirit, with other family member. Being family imprisoned together. Being Aftons trapped in mechanical forms in underground facility. Or animatronics being simply machines, being programmed, being non-conscious. Elizabeth being alone among machines, being only consciousness in facility full of animatronics. Being isolated even surrounded by others. Elizabeth's relationship with other animatronics being important for understanding Ennard, for understanding how possessed animatronics collaborated, how they planned escape, how they formed composite being, whether other animatronics were conscious or whether Elizabeth controlled everything, whether Ennard was collaboration or whether Baby dominated, being examined as ambiguous, being understood as unclear, being Elizabeth's time underground involving other animatronics somehow, whether as partners or as tools, whether as conscious beings or as mechanical resources, Elizabeth forming Ennard with them, using them, collaborating with them, being examined next, being her escape plan, being her desperate attempt at freedom. Forming Ennard, desperate plan for escape. Ennard was composite animatronic, being a combination of multiple Funtime animatronics, being Baby and Funtime Freddy and Funtime Foxy and Ballora merged together, being mechanical parts from multiple animatronics combined into single entity, being escape plan, being way to leave underground facility, being strategy developed over years or decades. Elizabeth and possibly other conscious animatronics planning escape, planning to combine into single entity, planning to use human body as disguise, as vehicle, as means of leaving facility without being recognized as animatronics. Ennard being brilliant plan, being desperate plan, being plan that required human victim, required person to be scooped, required body to be used. Ennard being plan that necessitated harm, that required victimizing someone, that demanded use of Brother Michael. Elizabeth being part of this plan. Being collaborator in Brother's scooping. Being willing participant in using Michael's body. Being desperate enough to harm Brother. Being imprisoned long enough to be willing to do anything to escape. Elizabeth's participation in Ennard plan being evidence of how imprisonment corrupted her, how decades underground changed her, how desperation made her willing to victimize Brother. Elizabeth being tragic figure, being victim who became victimizer, being person damaged by circumstances into harming others, being examined with nuance, being understood as complex rather than simple, being Elizabeth being sympathetic despite harming Michael, being tragic despite collaborating in scooping, being victim despite becoming threat. The plan requiring Michael to come to facility, William sending Michael to sister location, father sending son to underground facility, Michael coming to location, working nights, being guided by Baby, being manipulated by Elizabeth, Michael trusting sister, following instructions, being led through facility, being positioned correctly, being brought to scooping room, being place where Ennard could attack, could scoop him, could remove his organs, could hollow him out, could use his body. The scooping being horrific, being violent, being Michael being attacked by mechanical arms, being scooped, being organs removed, being insides extracted, Michael being hollowed out, being left as empty skin, being body without organs, being prepared for Ennard, being made into vehicle, into disguise, into way for animatronics to escape. Michael being victimized by sister, being used by Elizabeth, being harmed by family member, being Afton, family dysfunction continuing, being pattern of Aftons harming each other continuing. Michael being killed by sister's plan, just as crying child was killed by Michael's prank, being family destroying each other, being Aftons being each other's victims, being pattern established by William continuing in children, Elizabeth harming Michael, using brother, victimizing family member, being tragic, being evidence of how completely William destroyed his family, how thoroughly his evil corrupted everything. Elizabeth becoming person willing to harm brother, being result of William's failures, of his negligence, of his creating circumstances that led to this, being examined as family tragedy, as Afton family completely destroyed, as William's evil pervading everything. Living in Michael's body, grotesque survival. Ennard entered Michael's body after scooping, being composite animatronic climbing into brother's skin, being mechanical parts filling body that was emptied, being wires and endoskeleton and circuits inside Michael's form. Ennard wearing Michael, using his skin as disguise, as way to move through world, as vehicle for escape. Elizabeth being part of Ennard, being in brother's body, being using Michael's form, being escaping underground facility by becoming part of composite animatronic in brother's skin, being free, being out of prison, being in world again after decades underground. Elizabeth experiencing freedom, experiencing outside, experiencing life again, though she was mechanical thing in dead brother's body, being grotesque freedom, being disturbing liberation, being escape that required horrific means, Elizabeth being free but being in terrible situation, being using brother's corpse, being wearing Michael's skin, being mechanical thing pretending to be human, Ennard living in Michael's body being temporary solution, being unsustainable, being body decaying, rotting, becoming purple, becoming obviously wrong, becoming unable to maintain disguise, Ennard being forced to leave, being ejected, being vomited out of Michael's body, being composite animatronic leaving brother's form, climbing out through mouth, escaping into sewers, Michael surviving somehow, getting up, continuing despite being scooped, despite being corpse, Michael being living corpse, being purple zombie, being person who shouldn't be alive but was, being Afton family, being unable to stay dead, being pattern, Michael surviving scooping, being evidence of remnant, of supernatural persistence, of Afton's refusing to die, Elizabeth being part of Ennard that left Michael, being ejected from brother's body, being in sewers, being free from facility but being without disguise, being recognized as animatronic, being obviously mechanical, being composite entity, being Ennard. Let this imprisonment rest. As this section concludes, understanding that Elizabeth possessed Baby, that she spent decades underground, that she planned escape, that she formed Ennard, that she used Michael's body, that she escaped facility, that she was free briefly, being tragedy continuing, being suffering extending beyond initial death, being Elizabeth trapped for decades, being her escaping through terrible means, being her using brother, being her being desperate enough to harm family member, being examined comprehensively, being understood fully, being ready to continue to her separation from Ennard, to her deterioration into Scrap Baby, to her continued search for father, to her burning in Henry's fire, being explored after rest, being continued after sleep, being Elizabeth's story progressing, being tragedy continuing, being ready, after rest, to continue, to understand her final form, her ultimate fate, her supposed liberation, being examined soon, being continued after sleep. Part 3. Separation and Scrap Baby Alone Again, 2023. As we drift deeper still, as most listeners sleep peacefully, we explore Elizabeth's separation from Ennard, her being rejected by other animatronics, her deterioration into Scrap Baby, her continued existence as individual, as Elizabeth again rather than part of composite, being examined as rejection, as abandonment, as being alone again after brief period of collaboration, Elizabeth being kicked out of Ennard, being removed from composite, being separated from other animatronics, being alone in alley, being single entity again, being baby again, being Elizabeth as individual consciousness rather than part of collective, the separation being traumatic possibly, being rejection definitely, being other animatronics not wanting Elizabeth anymore, not wanting baby, not wanting her voice, her personality, her presence, the separation being because Elizabeth was too controlling possibly, because baby was too dominant possibly, because other consciousnesses in Ennard rejected Elizabeth's leadership, rejected her personality, rejected her presence, Elizabeth being kicked out, being rejected by other animatronics, being alone again, being an alley, being deteriorated, being damaged, being worse than before, being Scrap Baby now, being examined comprehensively, ejected from Ennard, rejection and isolation. Elizabeth was separated from Ennard, being removed from composite animatronic, being kicked out by other consciousnesses, being rejected by other animatronics who didn't want her anymore. The separation happening in sewers possibly, in alleys possibly, in hidden locations where Ennard existed after leaving Michael, Elizabeth being separated, being alone, being individual again, being baby again but being damaged baby, being deteriorated form, being Scrap Baby, the rejection being significant emotionally, being psychological impact, Elizabeth being rejected again, being abandoned again, being alone again, being pattern from her life continuing in her death, Elizabeth being neglected by father, being ignored by family, dying alone, being trapped alone underground for decades, finally escaping and collaborating with others, forming Ennard, being part of composite, then being rejected, being kicked out, being alone again, being pattern repeating, being isolation continuing, being Elizabeth never escaping being alone, being tragedy of perpetual isolation, of never being wanted, of always being rejected, of spending existence seeking connection and never maintaining it. Elizabeth being rejected by Ennard, being separated from other animatronics, being alone in alley, being Scrap Baby, being worse than before, being more damaged, being more deteriorated, being more obviously wrong, being examined as continued tragedy, as rejection piled on rejection, as isolation extending beyond death, beyond decades, beyond everything. Elizabeth never escaping being alone, being abandoned, being rejected. The physical form being deteriorated, baby being damaged from time in Ennard, from separation, from existing in harsh conditions, from being mechanical thing without maintenance, without repair, without care. Baby becoming Scrap Baby, becoming damaged version, becoming obviously broken, being claw, being enormous, being exaggerated, being prominent feature, being weapon, being tool, being what she had, what she could use, what defined her. Scrap Baby's design being disturbing, being unsettling, being showing damage, showing wear, showing deterioration, being Elizabeth in worst form, being most damaged, being most obviously mechanical, being most removed from human appearance, being most completely machine, Scrap Baby being what Elizabeth became, being final physical form before fire, being deteriorated baby, being damaged child consciousness in broken animatronic, being examined as physical manifestation of damage, as body showing psychological trauma, as exterior reflecting interior deterioration, Elizabeth being damaged physically and psychologically, being broken in form and spirit, being Scrap Baby being evidence of this, being visual representation of her complete damage, of her total deterioration, of her being worse than ever, being more tragic than ever, being more damaged than ever. Still seeking father. The search continues Elizabeth as Scrap Baby, continuing to seek father, continuing to want William's attention, continuing to be desperate for father's acknowledgement, being child consciousness that never stopped wanting father's love, that never stopped seeking his approval, that persisted in this need across decades, across death, across possession, across everything. Elizabeth being drawn to Freddy Fazbear's pizza place, being attracted to location, being lured there possibly by promise of father, by possibility of William being there, Elizabeth going to pizzeria, being salvaged, being brought into building, being contained in labyrinth, being trapped again but not knowing it, being positioned for fire, for destruction, for ending, but being there because she sought father, because she wanted to find William, because she still desperately needed his attention, his acknowledgement, his love, Elizabeth as Scrap Baby being motivated by same thing that killed her as child, being wanting father's attention, being seeking father's love, being desperate for William's acknowledgement, being pattern continuing, being motivation persisting, being Elizabeth never escaping her need for father, never overcoming her desperation, never moving beyond her childhood trauma, being stuck in pattern, being trapped in need, being forever seeking father who never cared, who never acknowledged her adequately, who never gave her what she needed. Elizabeth's continued search for father being tragic, being heartbreaking, being evidence of damage that William caused, of neglect that defined her, of need that killed her and continued beyond death. Family reunion. Father never acknowledges daughter. At Freddy Fazbear's pizza place, Elizabeth was present, William was present as Scraptrap, Michael was possibly present as night guard or as working for Henry. The Afton family being gathered, being together in location, being father and daughter and son all present, being family reunion, being tragic gathering, being Aftons together for first time in decades, William and Elizabeth both being possessed animatronics, both being corpses in suits, both being mechanical horrors, both being what they became, father and daughter both being monsters, both being damaged, both being deteriorated, both being worse than human, being family reduced to possessed animatronics, being Aftons as mechanical horrors, being what William's evil created, being what his negligence produced, being family completely destroyed, completely corrupted, completely transformed into horror. William and Elizabeth together at pizzeria, being father and daughter, both being possessed animatronics, both being there, both being trapped, but William never acknowledging Elizabeth, never recognizing daughter, never giving her attention even now, even when both were possessed animatronics, even when both were in building together, even when both were about to die. William never acknowledging Elizabeth, never showing recognition, never giving daughter what she desperately wanted, being final rejection, being ultimate failure, being father failing daughter completely, absolutely. Finally, Elizabeth seeking father, being drawn to location by possibility of finding him, being there because she wanted his attention, William being there but never acknowledging her, never recognizing her, never giving her anything, being pattern completing, being neglect continuing even into death, even into possession, even into final moments. William being terrible father until end, being person who never acknowledged daughter, who never gave her love, who never provided attention, being examined as ultimate family tragedy, as father and daughter together but never connected, as family reunion without recognition, as Aftons being together but being broken, being destroyed, being unable to be family even in final moments. Henry's fire, the second ending. Henry's fire destroyed Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place, burned building, eliminated animatronics, supposedly freed spirits, including Elizabeth. Henry's speech addressing everyone, including Baby, including Scrap Baby, including Elizabeth. Henry speaking to spirits, telling them it was time to rest, time to be free, time to end their suffering. Henry's fire being meant to liberate everyone, to free all spirits, to end all possession, to destroy all animatronics including Elizabeth, including Baby, including Scrap Baby, the fire-burning, consuming building, destroying animatronics, eliminating Elizabeth's physical form, burning Baby, destroying animatronic, freeing spirit supposedly, Elizabeth being burned, being destroyed, being eliminated, being ended, being freed supposedly, being able to rest finally, being able to stop existing as possessed animatronic, being able to move on, being liberated from decades of mechanical existence, from imprisonment, from suffering, from desperation, from seeking father, from being rejected, from being alone, from being damaged, from being Scrap Baby, Elizabeth being freed by fire, being liberated by burning, being ended by Henry's trap, by Henry's sacrifice, by fire that consumed everything, that destroyed everyone, that supposedly freed all spirits, including Elizabeth, including daughter who died because of father's creation, who spent decades as consciousness in machine, who sought father until end, who never received his acknowledgement, who never got what she needed, who died wanting father's love and died again, still wanting it. Elizabeth being burned, being destroyed, being supposedly freed, being examined as ending, as liberation, as freedom from suffering, as rest after decades of torment, as peace after lifetime of desperation, Elizabeth being freed supposedly, being able to rest finally, being done, being finished, being over. Ambiguity. Did Elizabeth find peace? Whether Elizabeth truly found peace being uncertain, being ambiguous like everything in FNAF. Whether fire freed her spirit being unclear. Whether she was able to rest being unknown. Whether she moved on or whether she persisted being debatable. The ambiguity being typical, being FNAF refusing certain closure, refusing definite answers, refusing to confirm that spirits were freed, that fire worked, that Henry's plan succeeded completely, Elizabeth's fate being unknown, being up to interpretation, being possible she found peace, being possible she moved on, being possible she was finally freed from suffering, from desperation, from seeking Father, from being alone, being possible she rests now, being possible she's at peace, being possible she's free from torment, or being possible she persisted somehow, being possible she continued somehow, being possible she never found peace, being possible she remains desperate, remains seeking Father, remains alone, the ambiguity being appropriate for FNAF, being typical of franchise, being refusal to provide certain ending, being maintenance of mystery, being Elizabeth's fate being unknowable, being uncertain, being subject to interpretation, being each person deciding whether Elizabeth found peace or whether she continued suffering, whether fire freed her or whether she persisted, whether she rests or whether she remains, being examined as final ambiguity, being understood as deliberately uncertain ending, being FNAF, being franchise maintaining mystery, being Elizabeth's story ending ambiguously, being appropriately tragic, being potentially peaceful or potentially continuing suffering, being unknowable, being uncertain, being examined completely now, being understood as ambiguous ending, being ready for thematic analysis, for understanding meaning, for examining what Elizabeth represents, being continued after rest. Let this ending rest. As this section concludes, understanding that Elizabeth was rejected by Ennard, that she deteriorated into Scrap Baby, that she continued seeking Father, that she was at pizzeria with William, that Father never acknowledged her, that she burned in Henry's fire, that she was supposedly freed, that her ending was ambiguous, being tragedy complete, being story told fully from life to death to possession to supposed liberation, being examined comprehensively, being understood thoroughly, being ready now for thematic analysis, for understanding what Elizabeth means, for examining her significance, for comprehending her tragedy symbolically, being continued after rest, being explored after sleep, being almost finished, being nearly done, being ready to complete after rest, after letting this settle, after sleeping with understanding of Elizabeth's complete story, of her full tragedy, of her life and death and possession and ending, being ready to continue to final analysis, to thematic examination, to understanding meaning, being explored after rest. Part 4. The Meaning of Elizabeth. Understanding the Tragedy. As we approach the final understanding, as virtually all listeners sleep deeply, we examine what Elizabeth Afton means, what she represents, why her story matters, what themes her character embodies. Elizabeth being more than just victim, more than just William's daughter, more than just child who died, being symbol, being representation of ideas, being character whose meaning extends beyond literal events, Elizabeth representing childhood need for parental love, representing desperation for father's attention, representing how neglect damages children, representing how some people spend entire existence seeking love they never receive, representing tragedy of dying while seeking approval, representing irony of being killed by what you thought was made for you, representing suffering that continues beyond death, representing being trapped, being alone, being rejected perpetually, Elizabeth being examined thematically now, being understood symbolically, being analyzed as representation rather than just character, being meaningful beyond events, being significant beyond deaths, being important as symbol, as theme, as representation of ideas that make her tragic FNAF character, being explored now completely. Child seeking parental love. Universal theme. Elizabeth's primary significance being that she represents child-seeking parental love, being universal human need, being what all children need, being fundamental requirement for healthy development, being basic human necessity. Elizabeth representing this need unfulfilled, being child who desperately wanted father's love and never received it adequately. Elizabeth being symbol of children who seek parental approval, who desperately want acknowledgement, who need love from parents. Elizabeth representing this need taken to tragic extreme, being child who died seeking father's attention, who was killed by father's creation while thinking it was made for her, who spent decades as possessed animatronic still seeking father, who went to pizzeria hoping to find him, who never received his acknowledgement even in final moments. Elizabeth being symbol of unfulfilled need, of desperate seeking, of never receiving what you need, being universal theme, being something many people relate to, being experience of wanting parental love and not getting it, wanting father's attention and being neglected, wanting acknowledgement and being ignored. Elizabeth representing this pain, this desperation, this tragedy of unmet childhood needs, being examined as universal symbol, as representation of common human suffering, as character embodying pain that many experience, being child who needed love and never got it, being daughter who sought father and never found him, being person who died wanting what she never received, being examined as tragic representation of universal human need unfulfilled. The specificity of father-daughter relationship being important, Elizabeth specifically seeking father's love, specifically wanting William's attention, specifically being daughter desperate for daddy's approval, being specific dynamic, being particular relationship, being father-daughter bond that should exist but didn't. Elizabeth representing daughters who seek father's love, who want masculine parents' approval, who need acknowledgement from father figure, Elizabeth being symbol of daughters neglected by fathers, being representation of father-daughter relationships that fail, being embodiment of paternal neglect, of father failing daughter, of parent not giving child what child needs. Elizabeth's relationship with William being examined as symbol of failed fatherhood, of parental neglect, of father being absent, being cold, being neglectful, being prioritizing other things over daughter, being pattern that exists in real world, being dynamic many people experience, being pain many daughters feel, Elizabeth representing this, being a symbol of it, being character who embodies this suffering, who represents this tragedy, who demonstrates consequences of paternal neglect, of father not being there, of daughter seeking love from parent who doesn't give it. Elizabeth being examined as symbol of failed father-daughter relationships, being representation of paternal neglect, being embodiment of tragedy when fathers fail daughters. Irony of death, killed by gift. The profound irony of Elizabeth's death being central to her tragedy. Elizabeth being killed by machine she thought father made for her, dying because she approached animatronic thinking it was gift, thinking it was evidence of father's love, thinking, "Didn't you make her just for me, Daddy?" Approaching baby, believing animatronic was made for her, being killed because of this belief, dying because she thought father cared, being murdered by father's creation while thinking it was present, being killed by what she thought was evidence of love, the irony being profound, being cruel, being evidence of complete disconnect between Elizabeth's perception and reality. Elizabeth thinking Baby was made for her when Baby was actually made to kill children. Elizabeth thinking Father created gift when Father created murder weapon. Elizabeth dying because she misunderstood Father completely, because she desperately wanted to believe he cared, because she needed to believe she mattered to him. The irony being examined as central tragedy, as core of her story, as what makes Elizabeth's death particularly heartbreaking. Being killed by what you thought was made for you being ultimate irony, being worst possible version of seeking love and finding death, being desperate for approval and receiving murder, being wanting gift and receiving weapon. Elizabeth's death being examined as ironic tragedy, as cruel twist, as evidence of how completely William failed her, how absolutely he neglected her, how profoundly he damaged her by not giving her adequate attention, causing her to desperately seek meaning in his creations, to seek love in his machines, to approach deadly animatronic thinking. It represented his care, dying because she needed so badly to believe Father loved her. Eternal loneliness, never finding connection. Elizabeth's continued loneliness being significant theme, being pattern throughout her existence, Elizabeth being alone in life, being alone in death, being alone in possession, being alone until end. Elizabeth being neglected by Father, being isolated from family, dying alone, being trapped alone underground for decades, escaping and being part of Ennard briefly, then being rejected, being kicked out, being alone again, being alone until fire, being pattern of perpetual isolation, of never escaping being alone, of never finding lasting connection, of never being part of community, of never being adequately connected to others. Elizabeth being symbol of loneliness, of isolation, of never finding belonging, being representation of people who spend existence seeking connection and never finding it, seeking family and never having it, seeking love and never receiving it. Elizabeth being alone repeatedly, being isolated perpetually, being rejected continuously, being pattern throughout existence, being tragedy of never, escaping isolation, being suffering of perpetual loneliness, being examined as theme, being understood as significant element of her tragedy. Elizabeth never finding connection, never finding community, never finding family, never finding love, always being alone, always being isolated, always being rejected, being tragic pattern, being profound suffering, being loneliness as permanent state, as eternal condition, as what defined her existence from childhood through death, through possession, through ending. Elizabeth being alone, being examined as tragedy of isolation, being understood as symbol of perpetual loneliness, being representation of never finding connection, never belonging anywhere, never being wanted adequately, never receiving love, always being alone, always being isolated, always being rejected. Father's failure made physical, William's neglect embodied. Elizabeth being physical evidence of William's failure as father, being embodiment of his neglect, being proof of his inadequacy as parent. Elizabeth's entire tragedy being result of William's failures, being consequence of his negligence, being outcome of his prioritization of work over family, of creations over children, of evil over love, Elizabeth dying because William created deadly animatronic, because he brought daughter to location with deadly animatronic, because he warned her but didn't protect her, because he failed as father, Elizabeth's possession being decades of suffering, caused by William's initial neglect, her death being his fault, her suffering being his responsibility, her tragedy being his failure, Elizabeth being examined as evidence against William, as proof of his guilt, as demonstration of his complete inadequacy as parent. Elizabeth representing what happens when fathers fail daughters, when parents neglect children, when creators prioritize creations over family, when evil people have families. Elizabeth being William's failure made physical, being his neglect embodied in tragedy, being his evil affecting own family, being his corruption destroying own daughter. Elizabeth being examined as evidence, as proof, as demonstration, as physical manifestation of William's complete failure as father, of his total inadequacy as parent, of his absolute neglect of daughter, of his being responsible for her death, her suffering, her tragedy. Elizabeth being William's fault, being his failure, being his neglect made manifest, being examined as such, being understood as symbol of parental failure, being representation of what happens when fathers neglect daughters, when parents prioritize wrong things, when families are destroyed by parents' choices. Elizabeth being this, being evidence, being proof, being William's failure embodied. The meaning for FNAF. Humanizing the horror. Elizabeth's significance for FNAF being that she humanizes horror, being that she makes tragedy personal, being that she transforms possessed animatronics from simple monsters into tragic figures, into victims, into people who suffered. Elizabeth being example of this, being child who died tragically, who had reasons for dying, who had psychology, who had needs, who was person before being animatronic. Elizabeth's story making Circus Baby sympathetic, making Scrap Baby tragic, making possessed animatronic into victim rather than villain. Elizabeth being examined as humanizing element, as character who adds emotional depth, who creates sympathy, who makes audience feel for possessed animatronics rather than just being scared of them. Elizabeth representing FNAF's approach to horror, being franchise that makes monsters sympathetic, that gives possessed animatronics backstories, that explains why they're angry, why they're dangerous, why they attack. Elizabeth being example of this, being possessed animatronic with tragic story, with understandable motivations, with sympathetic background. Elizabeth being examined as representative of FNAF's strength, being example of what makes franchise compelling, being demonstration of how horror becomes meaningful when it's personal, when it's tragic, when it's about people rather than monsters, when it's about families destroyed rather than simple scares. Elizabeth being this, being humanizing element, being tragic figure who makes FNAF emotionally rich, being character who adds depth, who creates sympathy, who transforms horror into tragedy, being examined as significant for franchise, being important for FNAF's success, being part of what makes series compelling, being example of how FNAF does horror right, being tragic figure who matters. Let these meanings rest. As this section concludes, understanding Elizabeth's thematic significance, her symbolic meaning, what she represents beyond literal events, Elizabeth being child-seeking parental love, being victim of ironic death, being eternally lonely figure, being evidence of father's failure, being humanizing element for FNAF, being examined completely, being understood fully, being recognized as complex symbol, as rich thematic element, as character whose significance extends beyond plot, beyond death, beyond literal tragedy into territory of meaning, of representation, of symbolism. Elizabeth being meaningful, being significant, being important not just for what happened to her but for what she represents, being worthy of examination, being deserving of analysis, being character worth understanding deeply, being a tragic figure worth exploring comprehensively, being Elizabeth Afton as symbol, as theme, as representation, as meaning, being understood now, being examined completely, being ready for conclusion, for final rest, for ending that honors her story, for compassionate closure, being ready after rest, being prepared after sleep, being Elizabeth's story nearly complete, being tragedy nearly told, being ready to conclude soon, after rest, after letting this settle, after sleeping with understanding of Elizabeth's meaning, of her significance, of her thematic importance, being ready to continue to conclusion after rest. Conclusion. Honoring Elizabeth's tragedy and final rest. As we reach the ending of this comprehensive exploration, as all listeners sleep peacefully, we gather all threads of Elizabeth Afton's story, understanding her complete journey from neglected daughter to child, seeking father's love to victim of father's creation, to possessed animatronic to Ennard, to scrap baby to supposedly liberated spirit. Elizabeth being character who spent entire existence seeking love she never received, seeking father's attention that was never adequately given, seeking connection that was never maintained. Elizabeth being tragic figure, being innocent victim, being child who deserved protection and received danger, who deserved love and received neglect, who deserved father's attention and received only father's deadly creations. Elizabeth's story being examined completely now, being told fully from beginning to end, from life to death to possession to supposed liberation, being understood thoroughly, being explored compassionately, being honored respectfully. Elizabeth deserving this, deserving to be remembered, deserving to be understood, deserving to have her tragedy told completely, told gently, told with recognition of her complete innocence, her absolute victimhood, her tragic circumstances, being Elizabeth Afton, being William's daughter, being child who died seeking father's love, being possessed animatronic who continued seeking it, being scrap baby who sought him until end, being spirit supposedly freed by fire, being examined completely, being understood fully, being ready now for final rest, for conclusion that honors her story, for ending that recognizes her tragedy. The arc complete, from neglected daughter to supposed peace. Elizabeth Afton's journey beginning as daughter, as child, as little girl in William Afton's house, being neglected, being seeking father's attention, being desperate for love, being wanting acknowledgement, being drawn to Circus Baby thinking animatronic was made for her, being killed by machine father created, dying inside storage tank, her body being hidden underground with animatronic, Elizabeth's spirit possessing baby, being trapped in machine that killed her, spending decades underground, being isolated, being imprisoned, being suffering continuing beyond death, Elizabeth as baby planning escape, forming Ennard, using Michael's body, escaping facility, being rejected by other animatronics, becoming scrap baby, continuing to seek father, going to pizzeria hoping to find him, father never acknowledging her, burning in Henry's fire, supposedly being freed, supposedly finding peace, being liberation ambiguous, being ending uncertain, being possibly at rest or possibly continuing suffering. Elizabeth's complete arc being journey from neglected daughter to deceased child, to possessed animatronic to supposedly freed spirit. Being transformation showing her suffering, showing her desperation, showing her never escaping patterns established in childhood, never escaping need for father's love, never escaping isolation and rejection, never finding peace in life or possibly in death, being complete tragedy, being story of suffering, being tale of unfulfilled needs, being Elizabeth Afton from beginning to end, being examined fully, being understood completely. Innocent victim, Elizabeth did nothing wrong. Understanding that Elizabeth was completely innocent, being absolute victim, being child who did nothing wrong, being daughter who simply wanted father's love, being person whose only mistake was approaching animatronic seeking connection to father, being killed not because of any fault of her own but because father failed to protect her, because William created danger and exposed daughter to it, because father neglected her. Elizabeth being blameless, being innocent, being deserving of sympathy, deserving of compassion, deserving of recognition that her tragedy was not her fault, that her death was William's responsibility, that her suffering was caused by father's failures. Elizabeth being examined as innocent victim, being understood as blameless child, being recognized as person who deserved better, who deserved protection, who deserved love, who deserved father's attention, who deserved to live, who deserved to grow up, who deserved normal childhood, who deserved everything she didn't receive. Elizabeth being completely innocent, being absolute victim, being child who did nothing wrong, being person whose tragedy was entirely fault of others, entirely result of father's failures, entirely consequence of William's evil. Elizabeth being innocent, being blameless, being deserving of compassion, being examined as such, being understood as pure victim, being recognized as child who suffered because of adults' failures, because of father's neglect, because of circumstances beyond her control. Elizabeth being innocent, being victim, being deserving of respect, of compassion, of recognition of her complete innocence. The tragedy of perpetual seeking. Elizabeth's story being fundamentally about seeking what she never found, being about wanting what she never received, being about needing what was never given. Elizabeth seeking father's love from childhood, through death, through possession, through ending, never receiving it adequately, never finding it, never getting what she needed. Elizabeth's perpetual seeking being her tragedy, being her suffering, being pattern that defined her existence. Elizabeth always seeking, never finding, always wanting, never receiving, always needing, never being fulfilled. Being tragedy of perpetual unfulfilled need. Being suffering of continuous seeking without finding. Being pain of wanting love and never receiving it adequately. Elizabeth being examined as a symbol of this. Being representation of perpetual seeking. Being embodiment of never finding what you need. Elizabeth's story being about this fundamentally. Being about wanting father's love and never getting it. About seeking connection and always being alone. About needing acknowledgement and never receiving it. About dying while seeking and continuing to seek after death and seeking until end and possibly never finding peace. Elizabeth being examined as tragedy of perpetual seeking. Being understood as story of unfulfilled needs. Being recognized as tale of wanting what you never receive. Being Elizabeth always seeking father, always wanting love, always needing acknowledgement, never receiving it, never finding it, never getting what she needed, being her tragedy, being her suffering, being her story, being examined completely, being understood fully. Father and daughter never connecting. The relationship between William and Elizabeth being examined as ultimate failure, as complete disconnect, as father and daughter who never connected, who never had adequate relationship, who never shared love appropriately. William being neglectful father, being absent parent, being person who failed Elizabeth completely, Elizabeth being desperate daughter, being seeking child, being person who needed father and never had him adequately, their relationship being one-sided, being Elizabeth seeking and William not responding, being daughter needing and father not providing, being child wanting love and parent not giving it, William and Elizabeth being together at pizzeria, being both possessed animatronics, being both in building, being both about to die, William never acknowledging Elizabeth, never recognizing daughter, never giving her anything, being final failure, being ultimate disconnect, being father and daughter together but never connected, being relationship that never worked, that never functioned, that never provided what Elizabeth needed. William and Elizabeth being examined as failed relationship, as father failing daughter completely, as parent never giving child what child needed, as William being terrible father, as Elizabeth being tragic daughter, as their relationship being one of complete failure, of absolute disconnect, of never connecting despite daughter's desperate seeking, of father never responding to daughter's needs, being examined as tragedy, as relationship failure, as William and Elizabeth being father and daughter who never truly were father and daughter, who never connected adequately, who never loved appropriately, who never had relationship that functioned, being failure, being tragedy, being examination complete, permission to rest completely, honoring Elizabeth's memory. And now, with Elizabeth Afton's complete story told, with daughter's full tragedy explored, with child victim's entire journey examined, with innocent daughter's suffering understood, with neglected child's complete desperation comprehended, you can rest completely, can sleep deeply, can drift into peaceful dreams knowing Elizabeth's story, knowing her tragedy, knowing her complete innocence, knowing her desperate seeking, knowing her perpetual loneliness, knowing her never receiving what she needed, knowing her story from beginning to end, from life to death to possession to supposed liberation, knowing Elizabeth Afton completely, knowing Circus Baby fully, knowing Scrap Baby thoroughly, knowing William's daughter comprehensively, being able to rest with this complete understanding, to sleep with this comprehensive knowledge, to drift away knowing that Elizabeth's story is told, that her tragedy is examined, that her character is understood, that her innocence is recognized, that her suffering is acknowledged, that her memory is honored, being able to rest completely now, being able to sleep deeply now, being able to drift peacefully now, knowing everything, understanding completely, being finished with examination, being done with exploration, being complete with analysis, being ready to sleep, being ready to rest, being ready to dream, being far from Elizabeth's tragedy, being distant from her suffering, being separated from her pain, being safe in sleep, being protected by knowing this is fiction, being comforted by understanding story is told, Elizabeth being honored, being remembered, being understood, being examined with compassion, with respect, with recognition of her complete innocence, her absolute victimhood, her tragic circumstances, being Elizabeth Afton's story complete, being tragedy told fully, being examination finished, being ready now to rest completely. Final gratitude and gentle farewell. Thank you for joining this complete exploration of Elizabeth Afton's story, for staying through her tragedy, through her death, through her possession, through her suffering, through her supposed liberation, for caring about understanding this tragic character, for wanting to know her complete story, for being here as we honor her memory, as we recognize her innocence, as we acknowledge her suffering, as we understand her tragedy completely. Thank you for listening, for caring, for exploring this sad story, this heartbreaking tale, this tragedy of daughter seeking father's love and never receiving it adequately. Thank you for being here through comprehensive examination of Elizabeth Afton, of Circus Baby, of Scrap Baby, of William's daughter, of innocent child victim, of neglected daughter, of person who deserved better. Sleep now, completely, finally, deeply, peacefully, far from Elizabeth's tragedy, far from animatronic horrors, far from family dysfunction, far from everything except peace, except rest, except dreams, except understanding that Elizabeth's story is told, that her tragedy is honored, that her memory is respected, that her innocence is recognized. Sleep knowing Elizabeth Afton from beginning to end, knowing her life, knowing her death, knowing her possession, knowing her suffering, knowing her seeking father, knowing her never receiving adequate love, knowing her complete tragedy, knowing everything about William's daughter, being complete understanding now, being comprehensive knowledge now, being thorough examination finished now, being ready to sleep completely, to rest deeply, to dream peacefully, being done with Elizabeth, being finished with tragedy, being complete with examination, being ready for sleep, for rest, for dreams, for peace, for distance from sadness, for separation from suffering, for safety in sleep, being protected by fiction, being blessed with distance from Elizabeth's pain, being able to rest knowing she was innocent, knowing she deserved better, knowing she was victim, knowing her story is told, knowing her tragedy is honored, knowing her memory is respected, being finished now, being done now, being ready to sleep now completely, deeply, peacefully, finally, being Elizabeth Afton's story complete, being daughter's tragedy finished, being innocent victim's examination concluded, being ready now to rest completely, sleep deeply, dream peacefully. Elizabeth's story is told, the tragedy is honored, her memory is respected, she was innocent, she deserved better. Good night.